So, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to this presentation, which is part of a GOOS webinar series exploring issues and projects associated with global sustained ocean observing. I'm Albert Fisher. I'm the director of the Global Ocean Observing System Office, which is based at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in Paris, and I'll be moderating today. And during the next hour, we'll start with an approximately 30-minute presentation from Neville Smith, who is co-chair of the steering committee of the Tropical Pacific Observing System in 2020 project, which we'll be talking about today, along with Billy Kessler. Neville is retired from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, and he's also served in the past as chair of the Ocean Observations Panel for Climate, which is a panel of GOOS, and he started the Godet Ocean Forecasting Research Coordination Project. After Neville's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session by chat, and I'll be moderating and asking the questions verbally. The chat window is open already in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So you can ask clarifying questions already and start asking questions for the end of the webinar as well. The session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted on the GOOS webpage.
Did you ask me
Neville,
to turn
I'll
the
turn it
camera
over
on?
to you and encourage you to turn your camera on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I should apologise if you hear some sounds in the background because it's raining very heavily here in Melbourne early in the morning, but I hope you can still hear me clearly above that. As Albert said, I'm going to introduce the Tropical Pacific Observing System 2020 project, and I hope in the next 30 to 40 minutes to give you an idea of where we've been and where we're hoping to go to over the next 4 years. Here's a quick outline of what I hope to cover. Roughly half of my time will be spent on the first 2 or 3 items, and the rest, time permitting, on those final 5 or 6 items. I'm just going to show one slide as background to the project itself. I call it a roller coaster ride, but in some sense there's a tremendous amount of success in the history of the observing system of the tropical Pacific, dating back to the 80s and 90s. But we had an experience through 2012 and 14 where there was a large dropout in the returns from the tower part of the tropical Pacific observing system. And from about 2013, and in fact continuing to the present, a gradual reduction in the number of Triton moorings, which you can see in the bottom left-hand panel. And it was these events which triggered a review and workshop in 2014, January in La Jolla, and out of that was created the TPOS 2020 project, which in essence was to review and redesign the observing system, with a project lasting roughly 6 years. Our goals, as briefly as we can document them, and you can look at the TPOS website, which is on the screen, for more details on these. These are from the prospectus. First, to redesign and refine the observing system, primarily with ENSO as the focus, but not exclusively so, but also to advance understanding of its causes. The second was a more general one around supporting prediction systems for ocean weather and climate services and other relevant services for the region. And finally, to advance understanding of both the physical and biogeochemical/ecosystems variability and predictability. And that last part is really something that was sort of new for the design of the observing system. This will be the only organisational slide I will show, but it gives you a sense of how we're structured. We formally report back through the steering committee, the GOOS steering committee, but our real owners are the stakeholder agencies who are supporting the observing system and using the observing system in the tropical Pacific. And we are in constant contact with those agencies to help guide the project. As well as the steering committee, which I co-chair with Billy Kessler, we have created 6 task teams to look at various aspects of the observing system. And most of today I'll be talking around work that's been led by the backbone task team, the one on the left at the bottom. But the other 5 are also very important, as I'll show you in a minute. The backbone of the observing system is really around the fundamental core sustained contributions. If you come from the WMO community, you would be more familiar with the basic observing system, the CBS responsibility. And it's around these core sustained contributions that we've been doing a lot of our work over the last 12 months. It supports the public good applications and services like ENSO prediction systems, ocean prediction systems, weather prediction systems, as well as public good research, but with the priority being in that order, that we're really focusing primarily on the first, but really also keeping an eye on the second driver. The evolution of that observing system is through experimental R&D observations and systems and pilots. And it's really that third part which is the focus of the other 5 task teams, but with also some in the backbone task team, East and Western Pacific, planetary boundary layer, modelling and data assimilation, and biogeochemistry for now, but in the future, biology and ecosystems. The schedule for, if you like, the outputs of the project are really going to be through 3 reports. The first one, which is going to be a major focus of this presentation today, is what we're calling the Interim Report, which started off with a series of strawman ideas from the steering committee and the task teams about where we should take the observing system. We're building that now into a report around the backbone. There will be a mid-term report somewhere around the end of 2018, which will provide further refinement and we hope interim results from a number of pilot experiments. And then in 2020 we will give our final report, which will include the design. But it won't be just the design of the observing system. We'll be handing off implementation to JCOM and other groups, as well as spinning off a number of projects which we think will go through and be sponsored under research and other groups. The key point probably in this schedule is around 2019, where we happen to have scheduled 3 important events. Ocean OBS 2019, the WMO Congress meets in May of 2019, and the IOC Assembly would meet somewhere around June of 2019. And we're probably going to be targeting the midterm report at each of those 3 events, because we think that's where we can get the real impact. And the final report will be more around the transition and the routine of handing off responsibility to other groups. Scientific drivers, I just wanted to spend 10 minutes on this aspect. Of course, and I think most of the people in on this webinar will be familiar with El Niño, its broad impacts throughout the Pacific and through teleconnections to other parts of the globe. Its mechanisms are reasonably well understood now, though there's still a great deal of uncertainty, as we experienced with the predictions of the El Niño, which is now just coming to an end, or has come to an end, and the failed predictions of what didn't turn out to be an El Niño in the year prior to that. A lot of that for the observing system is around observing the surface ocean of the ocean and the subsurface, the thermocline and sea surface temperature, surface winds. But we're also concerned with the circulation, the flow of warm water, first to the east and then out through eastern boundary currents and through Rossby waves to other parts of the Pacific Basin, and then the inflows in interaction in the far western Pacific. This diagram is also convenient because it points to the importance of convection, the planetary boundary layers, the ocean and atmospheric boundary layers, and this is where we still have a large amount of uncertainty, and it's where a lot of our prediction systems still tend to struggle with errors and uncertainty. So that's the main focus. The other thing which is shaping our thinking is around low-latitude western boundary currents, the flows of heat and fresh water, if you like, from the equatorial region, equatorial waveguide, out into the subtropics and the extratropics, and trying to understand how that works and try to design the observing system to capture that better than perhaps we do at the moment, with a particular focus around the low-latitude western boundary current region and interaction with the Indian Ocean through the Indonesian through flow. That part is captured nicely in this schematic, which I didn't know who to credit to, but I suspect it's from some of our colleagues working in this region. And there's a very complex system of currents, a north equatorial countercurrent, equatorial undercurrent, north equatorial current, plus boundary currents, even in the vicinity of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And there's a lot of work going on through many different agencies and groups trying to understand this interaction. And the Maritime Continent Group, which is now setting up to study the work in the Indonesian archipelago and trying to understand its interaction in that region. So that's a key area for us, and a lot of our work over the next 4 years will be focused on improved understanding there. We're also very concerned with, as we have been as a community for the last 25 years, on the interactions in the upper ocean, if you like, the connection between the surface ocean and the fluxes of momentum, heat and moisture through the surface, and how that's communicated through things like the diurnal cycle and rectification into lower levels of the ocean, and ultimately the way it connects with the thermocline. We know from models used in operations and in experimental models that this is one of the areas where errors accumulate. The fact that when we go into the Eastern Pacific, we see systematic differences between the models representation of the thermocline and the equatorial waves that transport heat and fresh water along the equatorial waveguide interacting with the Eastern Pacific. We know that is a place where we see significant systematic errors. In the Western Pacific, things like the barrier layers and the way we treat salinity are also a cause for concern, along with the coupled interaction into the atmosphere. And we think probably a lot of the systematic errors that we see in couple prediction systems probably have their roots in the way we're treating convection, clouds and circulation. In the Eastern Pacific, there's a significant amount of interest here as well for a whole number of reasons. One I've already mentioned, and I'll come back to in a minute, but the other is around things like the double ITCZ, which we see in many couple models, and particularly in CMIP runs, which for a number of years we thought of as a systematic error in models. But there's at least some teasing evidence now that perhaps in nature there is a double ITCZ, and that perhaps for a number of reasons we're not capturing that as well as we would like. Our Eastern Pacific Group task team is particularly interested in this and trying to understand the couple mechanisms that lead to the ITCZ and the way that interacts with the coastal upwelling systems, including local atmosphere-ocean feedbacks. This does lead to systematic errors. If you look at a number of studies, including those with predictive systems, you will see large systematic errors in the Eastern Pacific and in the coal tongue on the Central and Eastern Pacific. And so both of these have been a focus for discussion as we look at the redesign of the observing system. And you see these in CMIP 5 models, and some of this was discussed in Chapter 9 of the 5th Assessment Report. The fact that in both seasonal prediction class models and in long-term climate change models, we see lots of systematic difference and a lot of diversity in the models and the way they capture that in their climatologies in comparison to observations. And this is particularly true there you see around 10 south in those models. The last one I wanted to draw attention to was the biogeochemistry, the carbon cycle of our problem. And again, there's been a lot of progress made in GOOS on integrating these aspects into the observing system. It was something that was started well over 20 years ago with the first design of the ocean observing system. And there's been a lot of progress, both technically and technology, but in understanding over the years, and particularly around understanding the links between intra-seasonal, interannual variability and the outgassing of CO2 from the tropical Pacific. We know now that there is a strong connection between El Niños and La Niñas and the peaks in that outgassing. And we think we're in an opportunity to enhance and improve the way we take systematic observations to understand this part of the system. We also think there is great potential to start a process of, if you like, including systematic contribution to the observing system beyond the carbon cycle of things like ecosystems, and that will be a focus for the latter half of the project. So as I mentioned right at the start, the last 12 months of our lives, and particularly the last 6 months, have really been devoted to drafting the interim report for TPOS 2020, with the major focus being around the backbone part of the observing system, the core fundamental contribution to the observing system. And in this case, for the interim report, drawing on existing evidence and experience that we've gathered over the last 25 years since TOGA, but particularly over the last decade, where a lot of advances have been made in knowledge and in technology. We begin in that report by reassessing the requirements of services and research. And as I'll indicate in a minute, not a great deal has changed. It's not a staggering change from what we were in fact seeing as the requirements even 20 years ago. But some of those subtle changes are very important. I'll discuss some of the design principles in a minute, and also our initial response to the requirements, which is where a lot of the reaction has been focused. And of course, observing that the implementation options available now, say compared to 1995 at the end of TOGA and the first observing system design report, and in updates since then, have really changed. We will also cover in that report some of the evolution and transition issues that we will be facing into the future. The structure and framework, not surprisingly, follows that of the framework for ocean observing, but perhaps doesn't follow it as well as perhaps I would like and perhaps some others would like. We spent in setting requirements a reasonable amount of time. In fact, it's probably nearly a third of the report is focused around the requirements and the background of those requirements, but perhaps not using the framework as effectively as we would like, and noting that this research infrastructure part of it is also a key element of what we're doing and a key element of most of the sustained observing systems. We spent a lot of time in the initial report focused in what is called here the observations and deployment and maintenance part of it, but perhaps at the expense of really explaining the connections from the requirements through to response to those requirements and then the implementation. And in the second draft, we hope to do a somewhat better job of making those connections evident and drawing on the framework perhaps a little bit more strongly than we do. And this is probably in contrast to the presentation you had from, I guess it was Martin Visbeck on Atlantis, where they have much more closely tied their project to the framework and the various work packages in that project to the framework. We do devote one subsection of Chapter 2 to the socio-economic area, benefit areas. TPOS is in effect a public good, or provides public goods, things that in a sense are non-contestable. They're provided to a broad set of stakeholders. They're not private goods in the sense that commercial companies would provide services. Now, that's not true exclusively across the observing system, but for 98% of it, I think that's the right characterisation. And it's both for public good services, seasonal predictions, for example, weather predictions, as well as infrastructure for public good research. We provide a brief examination of relevant studies, and I'm not going to go into those today. The key benefit areas are like sub-seasonal to seasonal climate services and weather services. Many people will be familiar with figures like this one, which I borrowed from CPC and ENSO, which shows, at least in terms of weather patterns of droughts and rains, just where we are likely to experience the impacts of El Niño southern oscillation. In this case, it's showing the patterns for El Niño. In Australia, we're now starting to experience some of the impacts of the neutral and La Niña cycles, with lots of heavy rain in the east coast of Australia, just as we had in 2010. So a lot of this is very familiar. There has been some very good socio-economic studies, particularly from the US, but also in Australia and some parts of Southeast Asia, that have looked at some of the impacts, and the IRI has done excellent work over the last 15 years in following that through to impacts at regional levels. So we have a lot to work off there. We're less well set up for some of the other areas. The impacts of ocean observations and weather services does get some attention, but mostly it's around the impact on weather forecasting. The fact that we now know the mean sea level pressure measurements are probably amongst the highest impact per dollar spent of any measurements we take in modern NWP systems. But we don't have a way to trace, for example, the flux measurements, the other surface measurements, and understand how they impact across all of the socio-economic areas that weather forecasts impact. In ocean and marine environmental services, there have been some studies, but again, not at the level of detail that we would find useful for guiding observing systems. And the area of research, in fact, we don't have a lot of studies that trace how important infrastructure is for our research. Groups like the IOOS in the US and IMOS here in Australia have some evidence, but probably not in the form that can be really used to tightly constrain the design. The functions of the backbone are summarised on this page, and again, you can find more detail on the website. But in broad terms, it's ENSO and other forecasting systems is priority one in terms of the functions. Second is around quantifying the ocean state, principally on timescales from weekly out to decadal, if you like, the monitoring timescales. A key part is supporting integration of satellite and in situ approaches, including cross-calibration and validation, satellite calibration, in situ calibration, as well as in situ calibration of satellites, and in some cases vice versa. Understanding of the climate system, improved understanding is a key part, as well as maintenance and as appropriate extension of the tropical Pacific climate record. Some of these I can touch on later, but again, I'd refer you to some of the documents on the website for more details. On the requirements, it's broken into three parts at present. We're just going to, in fact, this morning we've already had a hookup to retune this approach in the second draft of the report. The first part is focused on improved state tracking. So this is service-driven climate monitoring, weather and ocean services. The second part is around the increased understanding of critical processes and phenomena. In some sense, it's research-driven, and it's research infrastructure that we're focusing on here. And the third element we looked at was the climate record, understanding and detecting change. And again, this is a key part of what we see as our mandate for the TPOS project. So what has changed? To some extent, not a great deal. The requirements on variables are generally more demanding. processes and features such as barrier layers, convergence zones and boundary currents are much more evident now than they were 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. New capability, particularly from satellites, but also from Argo and more capable moorings, is encouraging us to push the limits harder, I think. The planetary boundary layers are probably very much a challenge now as they were 20 years ago in getting fluxes and capturing fluxes and bringing that sort of capability to bear on forecasting systems. We're beginning the process of integrating biogeochemistry and hopefully then ecosystems homology into the design, and we touch on those requirements, but we have a long way yet to go in the project at articulating those requirements in detail. More in the context of a multi-purpose system, it's more than ENSO, which was really the focus back in 1995, and this is true, I think, right across GOOS and the observing system. We're aware of that multi-purpose, and it's one of the strengths of the integrated systems. Observations in the tropical Pacific are still doing much of the heavy lifting. The model skill, particularly in seasonal prediction, is evolving slowly, too slowly for some of us. And that just means the observations do a lot of work trying to counteract biases as well as do the initialization of the models. And so this complication of the presence of bias is something which we're still wrestling with in the design. Much in common with other tropical regions, you'll have seen some of it in the Atlantos presentation, and we also doing things which are very similar to what's happening in the Indian Ocean as well. The design principles, they're aligned with GCOS and the food principles largely, highlighting things like integrated responses to requirement, multiple sources of information, which I've already mentioned, using the global broad-scale systems, the things that underpin GOOS as the foundation, and building in situ and other techniques at things like regional error regimes and gaps. We're striving for platform-neutral recommendations and learning a few lessons here from WIGOS and their rolling review of requirements, and trying to separate out those recommendations from the discussion of implication. Modelling is a key part of the integration and path to impact, and it's probably one of our greatest challenges from where we sit at the moment. That I try to capture just in these two slides, and this is one from the European Centre. Tim Stockdale, I think, is probably the person I should credit for this. In their assessments, you see the gradual and incremental improvement in skill as you go through the various versions of their forecasting system, and this is replicated at other places like NCEP, the Bureau of Meteorology, JMA. The observations are doing probably more of the work compared to the model, and that's possibly just a reflection of the fact that the model skill is still struggling to be at the levels we would hope it to be at in 2016, and the fact that models, the observations, still do a lot of work trying to counteract the impact of biases in the forecasts. You can see that in a number of ways. You can see it in the systematic biases. This is the one from the CMIP runs, a similar one I showed just before. Particularly the systematic errors in the Central and Eastern Pacific and the Cold Tongue and in the Eastern Pacific. This one probably doesn't show it very well in the Western Pacific, but over there, relative to the signals, the biases there are probably even more significant. In what I've called the response, and this is for those of you who have seen the report, which we sent out to expert reviewers, the response, we have now a far richer choice among the platforms to satisfy those observational requirements. As I mentioned, more capable tropical moored array, multiple ways of measuring SST, wind, sea level anomalies from altimetry, ocean colour platforms and so on, as well as an impressive array of Argo floats, somewhere around 3,800 floats now through the the global system, and roughly a quarter of those, 20 to 25% of those floats in the tropical Pacific. And each of those platforms, as well as many other contributions, bring different values to the system. David Legler will have discussed some of this in the previous webinar, I'm sure. This is in fact the slide that he showed. He showed it in a slightly different context. I just put this one up, which is now focused on the tropical Pacific rather than the global system. Again, the legend here I just want to point people to, so the dark circles you'll see in a minute from Argo, the tropical moorings are the red squares you'll see in the centre, and there's a number of other contributions which David talked about at length in his presentation a few weeks ago. This is what it looks like blown up for the tropical Pacific. And I showed it here just to give you a sense of how you can draw on the different capability of, say, moorings and Argo floats, or moorings and the surface drifters in various regions of the tropical Pacific. They each have their own sampling strengths and weaknesses. We have been served mightily by the tropical moor array over the last 25 years, and it will continue to be a major focus of the observing system. But we need to get a balance between that and what capabilities we can bring from Argo, either in addition to the tropical mooring capability, or in some cases perhaps replacing that capability with satellites and tropical moorings. And that's a debate that's going to continue right through to the publication of the second draft of the interim report. And again, it's getting the right balance, the efficiency and the effectiveness, both for the service side of things, but as well as the underpinning the research and understanding and the evolution of the observing system. And in our broad conclusion is that everything we've got out there at the moment is doing a wonderful job in serving the community. There are no recommendations explicitly to decommission anything, but we do have a charge to try and set priorities, and from that priorities we might need to make some choices on where we put our investments over the coming decades. We took the interim report, the first draft, out to expert review, borrowed on some of the approaches and systems that the ITCZ use for reviewing their reports. We had around 65 nominated experts we drew on. We have 38 individual contributions coming back to us, which is an excellent response, probably higher than what we expected. And we now have over 1,100 separate comments to consider as we draft the second version of this report, the so-called second order draft. And in general, the comments were very thoughtful and helpful, and even the most critical comments are largely very helpful in what we're doing. Something like a half or a third to a half of those were explicitly pleased with what they saw in the report and went to great pains to point that out. So we need to balance that view versus the many critical issues that we've been asked to address as we redraft the report. And unfortunately, and this is not always true in these sort of exercises, we have comment and review and feedback on every part of the report, which is very helpful. We're in an intense period now of redrafting the reports. I was up at 4 o'clock this morning in a series of meetings, and they're going to continue over the next 4 weeks until the point we're ready to release the second report, which will have much broader stakeholder review, we hope, than we tried to achieve through the expert review of the first draft. Key issues, and I only just want to skim over these. The first draft and the expert review was really, we sometimes call it a friendly review. It wasn't so friendly in places, but we were really going out to people that understood the system, largely understood what we were trying to achieve, and get their feedback initially. And they made a number of very good suggestions on how we could improve the report. They focused in the fact that the traceability from recommendations and conclusions back through the requirements, that sequence that is outlined very well in the framework for ocean observing, wasn't as clear and as evidence-based as we would like and as they would like. and that's something we need to get right. The priorities tended to be blurred, again, partly because we didn't have those links clearly in there, as clearly evidence-based as we would like. The role and use of models we knew was weak. We just didn't have the time to develop this part as well as we would like. This group only came online towards the end of our of last year, and so the influence wasn't as strong as we would like, and that's been corrected for the second draft. We had some scientific gaps, some of them more embarrassing than others. We didn't treat intraseasonal and the Madden Julian oscillation, and particularly sub-seasonal prediction as well as we would like, and that really has to be corrected. Mean sea level pressure and waves were also skipped over, and that's something we have to correct in the second draft of the report. We also didn't concentrate on the size of the arcs, the cost, if you like, and many of our stakeholders, and particularly those external stakeholders, non-scientists, that we asked to have a quick look at it, went straight to that point, and that's something we're going to have to look at and are looking at in the second draft. We can also do far better in integration, and we're doing a slight restructure to try to address that, and that's an ongoing discussion within the steering committee and the lead author team. Some core contributions I don't think are sufficiently visible, things like GoShip, the VOS and the SOUP. We want to bring out that those are important contributions and remain important. And we're perhaps too much focused on the tropical moorings, probably for obvious reasons because of the sensitivity there and the fact that that's really what spurred the creation of the project in the first place. But we don't want to do that and not get the sufficient focus on the others and on where we're looking for trade-offs. This is the only slide I'm going to show from the preferred options. Again, for those who are interested, I can either point you to the relevant publications, or you can wait around till the second draft comes out. We tried to capture in the options, particularly around the tropical moor array and the Argo, and some of the trade-offs we could get by perhaps doubling or certainly substantially increasing the Argo sampling in the tropical region. We already know that with Argo you can capture a significant part of the intraseasonal and longer variability with Argo floats alone. There have been a number of studies that have shown that. But Argo can't and will never reproduce some of the information that we get from fixed point moorings, and particularly the fact that co-located surface flux and subsurface measurements. Excuse me a minute. Too much talking this morning. And we looked at also extensions of the tropical ray, particularly through the convergence zones and where we know we have systematic errors in the model. So, while at the one hand focusing a lot of focus on the equatorial waveguide and fluxes and currents, but on the other hand trying to broaden our fixed point views out into those convergence zones where we know we have a lot of systematic errors. And we have over the next 4 weeks a lot of work to do to retune some of that. The feedback we got from reviewers varied from everything from this is disastrous, you really haven't done a very good job on getting this balance right, to those who thought we'd done a very good job and this was the direction we should go and perhaps go even further. So that's something we're going to have to balance through and make sure that when we're making recommendations that we really have an evidence and a real basis for making those changes. Just to remind everyone, and I do this continually to people who are involved as lead authors in the steering committee, this is just the first draft of the first of 3 reports. We're working on the second draft now, and that will come out in July, and we will publish the final version of the interim report in December after our next steering committee meeting. We do need to strengthen arguments, and we need to ensure all recommendations have a sound scientific evidence based. But this will not be a report that just gets passed and published and then we move on to something else. We are going to start looking at transition, as I'll touch on in a minute, and it will be a handoff that's done over a number of months and years to make sure we get the handoff done correctly. We are focusing more on the implementation options and associated costs and benefits, and incorporating the research and development aspects, the evolution of the design, more explicitly in the body of the report. And our task teams have been doing tremendous work on that over the last 2 to 3, in fact probably too good, because the material they're coming back probably won't fit into the size we want to maintain. On the transition, so this is the first diagram, but now considerations of the transition in there as well. We have a short paper that Albert and others have seen, but it had very narrow circulation at the moment. But we would like to pass that around, particularly to others in JCOM over the next little while, and establish a transition team, probably in parallel with the publication of the Interim Report towards the end of this year, with a view to taking the recommendations out of the Interim Report and looking for implementation somewhere around 2018. It normally takes between 12 months and 18 months to go through the process of discussing what the recommendations mean, what's possible and available in the implementation community, and then coming to conclusions about how those changes should take place. So it's going to be a busy time over 2 years, and as I mentioned earlier, with Congress, the Assembly, and Ocean Obs 19 coming up in 2019, we will be probably starting that implementation and transition right through that period. So that process will be very important, will be far more visible in subsequent years. I'm going to finish there. I shouldn't finish though without thanking a whole lot of people. I won't go through all the names. The lead author team has just done a tremendous job in supporting the drafting, the first order draft, particularly Susan Weifels, who's enjoying a spell at sea for 4 weeks. I'm sure she's glad she's away from us for a little while. But there are a whole number of others. We're trying to broaden this team and bring in people, particularly from Northeast Asia and from South America, to get those perspectives. We have that in the steering committee, which I've listed there. But people who are chairing the task teams, and they're listed down below, have also done a mountain of work in supporting us over these first 1.5 years. And I shouldn't end without thanking those who support the Distributed Project Office, the First Institute of Oceanography in China, IMOS in Australia, and NOAA and NASA in the US. That team has just been doing a tremendous job as well, and I'm very grateful for their support. So Albert, why don't I finish there, and I hope I've left enough time for questions.
Thank you very much, Neville. And so the floor is open for questions. You can go ahead and type them into the chat window and I'll ask them, but I have a few questions of my own to kick things off. Neville, at the very beginning, you mentioned that the real owners of this project are the stakeholder agencies that are implementing and using the observing system.
So
what's the project's approach to growing that?
Honest, I think in this group,
you think you're going to be able to add
this part of it, we have a resources forum for TPOS,
complexity of
but it hasn't been as energetic and as visible as we would like. It's taken a while to get that spun up in the forum. We're hoping, in fact, we are intending to hold the second resource forum face-to-face in parallel with the CLIVAR conference in Qingdao in September. Part of that's just simply because as we spin up and get our ideas in place, they don't have anything to work off, no concrete recommendations to discuss. So it's a bit hard to have a dialogue which is conceptual rather than as concrete recommendations. The second draft is going to change all that. It will be a document that is digestible by our stakeholders in general, and it's that which we'll use as a basis to really energise those conversations over the next 6 to 12 months. One of the key parts for energising, if you like, the resource side, I don't think we're going to grow the committed, sustained operational resources, if you like. We might be able to grow it. We think we've got good reasons to grow that by, up to 5 to 10% maybe. But it's these projects which we're spinning off over the next 4 years where we hope to engage research agencies first, but then our operational agencies down the line and bring them into the picture gradually over the next 4 years. So it's a work in progress, but we would be the first to admit that there's a lot more work to be done in that space.
Okay, Neville, I know that you're in early days in terms of identifying what the plan is, but let's ask
broad
the
answer is
question.
Yes. So this is going to be pick up
Can you
as
say
part of the
something about the plan
transition
for
and
data
something
management
which
and
is
distribution? Will that be done
outlined
through
in the
existing
transition
mechanisms?
document.
Which
We
is
think
NOAA,
through working through
Argo,
existing
IMOS,
mechanisms, particularly through JCOM, but not exclusively JCOM. It will also pick up the GOOS regional alliances. But I think most of the infrastructure for data and information management is really being led out of JCOM and WIS within the WMO. And we see, the great opportunities to work through and with those groups, rather than perhaps trying to start up a separate activity underneath the TPOS banner. When this transition group is created, I suspect one of the first things we'll do is create a task team on data and information management to look at the issues that perhaps we're creating or exacerbating with our recommendations. If there are none, fine, but use that group then to really look after the transition and the data and information management issues as we bring these new streams. And it's probably going to be these new streams that are coming on board, which are already being brought to the attention of the existing infrastructure anyway. It's the BioArgos, ecosystem data and these sorts of things. But we may be able to help by prototyping some of those techniques and some of the, if you like, principles that underlie the data and information management systems.
All right, Neville, just a very basic question. You obviously have a very regionally focused project. Why is it important to take that regional approach? And then in the transition that you talk about giving this back to large
this
global
present
structures.
Moment, I think there is a little bit of a contradiction.
Is there a contradiction in that the importance of taking a regional approach in this project?
But maybe I think it's probably with the ocean community compared to, say, WIS and WIGOS and WMO. As you know, WIGOS is also going through if you like, a transition process as they go from systems in the past to a fully integrated system. And WIGOS is actively considering using mechanisms other than the regional associations to follow through implementation at a more detailed level. And inevitably what you come to then are using regional groupings, regional alliances much more actively. And I think the TPOS structure and creating a regional focus around implementation and maintenance for the tropical Pacific actually will fit in quite nicely with where CBS and WIGOS is going. And in fact, we've already had a number of early discussions with WMO folks on how that might work. In GOOS, I think it's around the GRA and JCOM intersection, which is where TPOS is going to land. I expect what we will spin off as part of the transition process in 2020 is a governance mechanism that will take the maintenance and oversight of the tropical Pacific forward into a GRA/JCOM framework. Now, just how that takes place is why we're wanting to start that conversation now rather than in 2020, because I think it's not evident how we do that with JCOM or how we do that with the GRAs or otherwise. And I think that's something we then have to pick up a conversation, do it now and try and get an understanding of how that might work. I suspect, without knowing, that Atlantis will land in exactly the same space, that through that project, one of the things they will spin off is a governance mechanism that will oversight and coordinate the contribution from there on behalf of JCOM and all regional alliances. Only in their case, of course, they have EuroGOOS as and to some and I guess IOOS in the US as starting blocks for doing that. I think certainly down the line,
Niño has a question about whether there'll be
we took in the
recommendations
first
for the
ever
Rama
steering
and
committee
Prada
meeting is that
arrays,
we had
which
to
makes
open
sense
up
in the
this
sense that the
dialogue,
tropical Pacific is a driver
particularly with the Indian Ocean, but I think it's also
tropical
because of the
variability
commonalities with Prada. But it's also an action that we haven't really followed through in any detail yet. At the moment, we're looking for opportunities, at conferences like the Ocean Sciences Conference in New Orleans in February this year, and at the Clivar Conference in October, to have joint either town halls or meetings with Atlantos and, where possible, with Rama and the Indian Ocean Group, to make sure that we're doing things in parallel and not doing things separately. I think this is also a responsibility that falls on the GOOS Steering Committee's shoulders. They hear from each of us from time to time, and mostly at the Steering Committee meetings. I think they need to be overlooking and at the recommendations that come out, and make sure that we're not going in directions which are at right angles to where, say, Atlantos. Certainly from within TPOS, we try to do that as best we can. But I think, again, that's an interface that we just got to keep an eye on. One of the projects around the maritime continent in the Indonesian archipelago is going to be a natural place for us to join up with the Indian Ocean folk, because a lot of the same communities are concerned with that, and we're going to actively use that project as one way of talking to our Indian Ocean friends, as well as the Western Pacific project. And we've got a couple of sub-projects there, I think, which will have common recommendations with the Indian Ocean Observing System and the TPOS will be joined together on.
So let's come a little bit to the recommendations. You actually talked a lot in the scientific motivation about the coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere, and is there going to be consideration in the project of the atmospheric observations necessary to capture that
group,
coupling?
which has both atmospheric and oceanic boundary layers? We admitted right from the outset that we had to look across the interface, and it didn't make sense to just stop at the ocean surface, that we had to bring in the planetary boundary layer. But no sooner had we done that than particularly the Eastern Pacific group, but now increasingly the Western Pacific group, are looking at issues and problems which take you out of the boundary layer, and particularly looking at convection, clouds, convection and circulation. And there's an intersection with some of the focus areas for the WCRP. Yet, when you go back now and look at our terms of reference are around the tropical Pacific, in brackets, ocean observing system. And so this is a little balance that we have to do, and it's one of the feedbacks we'll be seeking in the second report from our stakeholders. To what extent should we go across that boundary layer? I don't think we can do as good a job on the atmospheric measurements in general for the sustained observing system. That is already getting done within WIGOS and WMO, and they have much more sophisticated models and techniques to get at those. But where I think we can be influential is in these projects that we're spinning up, and allowing those to encroach into those areas, and perhaps partnering with our atmospheric scientists, our colleagues, and National Weather Services in some of the issues there. And I say that particularly is the case for the Eastern Pacific, but now increasingly for the maritime continent and the Western Pacific projects as well. So that's something we're just going to have to keep grey and be pragmatic about, I think, as we go forward.
Do you think there'll be any suggestions for process studies?
This aspect has probably tortured me just about anything else in this project.
Are often
the
used
fact
to
that we have errors, systematic errors and biases in models, which are of the same order as the signals we're trying to constrain when we do initialization. We've struggled to find the right route to address that. What we're doing now is we're coming up with a number of pilot projects being led by the modeling and data assimilation group, our task team, but also from the Western Pacific and Eastern Pacific, trying to target those areas and get a critical mass of people looking at that. And again, wherever possible, partnering with other groups. I think, and this is a personal view, but I know it's shared by a couple of others, is that we're facing this problem of probably looking at something of the scale of TOGA core as a very large process experiment, probably not done in the time frame of TPOS 2020, but being designed and perhaps initiated within this project to try and address this. I actually don't think we're going to make that breakthrough unless we have a concerted effort of that scale. But it's not just something we can create and do from within TPOS 2020. That would have to be a shared vision of many others before we would go down that line. But it's something that independently a number of people have concluded.
Something to float at the Cliver Science Conference. So let me ask Jim's question.
That's certainly part of the design.
And
again, it's one of those grey areas.
Started talking about deep measurements, but are there plans to use deep measurements from
moorings?
My
co-chair has often asked
platforms to provide validation. And
if we had to go into the atmosphere or into the deep ocean, which one would you do first? And I think probably it's into the atmosphere first, but we do need to consider what's being developed in the deep ocean observing system, and I know that's just starting to get some legs and kick off now with the plan. And of course, there are roles both in cross calibration and the fact that the upper ocean, the surface, the measurements in the top, say 1,000 metre of the ocean, which is where we're mostly focusing, are going to be important for the deep ocean and vice versa. We haven't done a lot of work on this, but it's something we're going to come back. We touched on it in the second steering committee meeting, and we may pick it up as one of the sub-projects in the second report. If not there, we'll pick it up as a sub-project, I think, in the backbone task team once they've finished all of this work for the interim report.
Neville, at one point you mentioned that you'd like to, in future iterations, to strive more for platform-independent requirements, like the WMO process. I'm just wondering how feasible that is in the ocean. One of the ideas in essential ocean variables in the framework is the idea of balancing feasibility
not be the right word.
The impact. Or the
this is not going to be something with a brick wall in
feasibility,
between the two.
The platform capabilities
it's something
are
where I think it's better to have a dialogue when you've got options around implementation and platforms. And the key one for us is around the capabilities that you say get from a scatterometer versus those you get from fixed point mooring versus those you get from Argo. How do you balance those? And I don't think it's something where you can turn the handle and there's a formula. It has to be in a dialogue. What are the capabilities that agencies can bring to the table? In the impact feasibility diagrams, you can put them into if you like, one of the boxes in a 4 square diagram. Maybe you even get Gamer and put them in a 9 square diagram. But in the end, you have to have a dialogue with the groups that can bring that capability, how ready they are, how ready the technology is. So, for example, in one spot in the interim report, I think we have to acknowledge that new technology, say in 3 to 4 years' time, may do some heavy lifting in places where we're looking for the traditional technology to do it. Do we just stop and wait for that new technology to be proven, or do we put in a transition so that we have an evaluation of that new technologies that comes online and delay any changes until we have some certainty about whether that's going to be good or not. So that's the sort of dialogue. I like the way GOOS and the rolling review of requirements, for example, makes recommendations that are largely agency neutral and sometimes platform neutral. So they'll make a recommendation around scatterometers that says generally we can meet the threshold of our requirements with 2 scatterometers, but with 3 and different equator crossing times and different capabilities, we can, get a breakthrough, if you like, a baseline that really does meet the requirements in a way that we can't do at present. And that's the sort of recommendation I'm encouraging people to look at first before they get into a debate of whether we need 10 moorings at this location, at this latitude and at this longitude and so on. Before we put dots on maps, have that conversation first. And I don't think that is inconsistent with what you're trying to do in the framework. It's those little arrows that come down from the requirements into the implementation space.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think that dialogue is particularly important when some of the major beneficiaries of this observing system are not the ones necessarily who are implementing them, because we're still working in this kind of research infrastructure mode. So
those we're trying to develop,
using some of the outputs are
we tentatively agreed on 3 or 4 areas of work at the last
Let me ask Denise a question. Are there strong links between TPOS 2020 and some of the task teams?
And the modelling and data assimilation task team are picking those up as we speak. So some of those are going to be captured in the second draft of the report. We need to strengthen those. We've been mainly working with the validation team in G'day Ocean View, but also increasingly working with those looking at some of the sensitivity to various observing systems. My own view is that the G'day Ocean View class of models is probably better to work with in terms of understanding sensitivity to different data sources than the couple models where systematic errors and biases just complicate the interpretation. And some of the nicest work has been done by people like Fuji-san in JMA or Ocean Research Institute, and some of those results are really very helpful. And he's one of the leaders in the G'day Ocean View side of things. So we're trying to make those links as strong as we're possible and as active as we possibly can.
So Neville, we're actually slightly over time, but I have one last question to ask you. You talked about the motivation for the TPOS backbone as being public good applications and services and public good research. How well did
I don't know whether many folk have looked at
arguments resonate in the stakeholder
the national
and how
report on civil Earth observations in the US. It was published in 2014. I have to admit, I didn't look at it until the last 3 weeks, but that's effectively the framing they use for all of the Earth observations in the US. Now, I haven't really got an appreciation for what currency that has yet amongst all the agencies, but I think they've actually got the framing right, and particularly this split between sustained and experimental observations. I'm a little bit more familiar, in fact, with the Copernicus structure in Europe and the way the Copernicus supports both the sustained observations within Copernicus and particularly within the satellite components of Copernicus and the H2020 structure, which supports a lot of the experimentation. And I think they're both consistent with this sort of framing. And I think probably in the first draft of the report, we haven't quite exploited that in the way I think we should be. As always, if we can lean on structures which already have some acceptance, it makes our job, I think, of selling the report to stakeholders a little easier. And the plan is that we might do that in this next report.
All right, thank you very much, Neville. We have really run out of time, so let me thank you again for waking up early after a late night teleconference and giving this talk to us. And thank you for the audience for joining us. And we keep tuned to the GOOS website or GOOS emails or Twitter for the announcements of the next webinars. Thank you very much.
All right, bye.